Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. This is actually our last episode in our little political parties deep dive that we have. So Dr. Beienberg is back with us. And Dr. Beienberg, this is kind of an overview question, but I feel like, in a classroom setting, in a learning setting, it's a good question to start with. And then if people want to go back and kind of learn more specifics. But what I'd like to know is, how have the Democratic and Republican parties changed over time?
Yeah, so there's three ways that we can think of party changes. And this will then sort of kind of work around in an odd way because I'll suggest some continuities. So the ways that I think we can think of when you look at a political party, you can think, what does this party believe? Have they changed their beliefs? Have they adopted the other parties? Have they adopted a third parties? Have everybody agreed on an issue, right? So what do they believe? A second question would be, where does this party succeed electorally? What's its geographic base? Is it strong in the South? Is it strong rural? Is it strong in the West, right? Is it strong? Like, where does it win elections? And then the third one would be sort of, what kinds of people or what constituencies or groups or demographics make up this party? Is this a party that does well among merchants? Is this a party that does well among Protestants? Is this a party that does well among, pick whatever demographic group? Is this a party that does particularly well among women or poorly among, right? So basically, the three things that I think of that we can think of a party is geography, ideology, and demographics. And on each of these, there are places where the parties have had continuity and where there has been some shifts. So maybe we'll start with the geography. This one is, and I think you'll see some places where it shifts, and then where it doesn't shift, I think will helpful to us. Okay. So if we think about the Republican Party in, say, the late 19th, early 20th century, it doesn't exist in the South, basically. It's pretty much doesn't exist there. The Democratic Party has complete dominance of the South after they basically disenfranchise Black Americans. And we'll talk more about that with the failure of the Lodge Bill, I think in the history series we'll do later, right? So South, very Democratic. New England, very Republican. Midwest, very Republican. California, the Pacific West sort of moderately, the Pacific West and Mountain West sort of in play a little bit, right? So if we look at parties today, New England and the Pacific states have now become basically very strongly Democratic. New Hampshire is sort of a weird exception, but basically pretty Democratic. And the South, pretty Republican, although Virginia is then sort of moving, in some sense, looking more like the North in that sense, insofar as its base is shifted much more towards sort of federal workers. The Midwest basically still stays the same, right? The Midwest is still Republican leaning, at least at the presidential level. Again, you're always going to have like an odd candidate or a period of elections, but I think it's most folks. So that I think helps to complicate. And then the Mountain West is, again, sort of, it was in play in the early 20th century and it's still in play again. Which states are hopping around, but Arizona and Colorado are swing states. Utah is not. Wyoming is not. But
can you quickly define what a swing state is for somebody listening who is like, I've heard this term. What does that mean?
Sure. A state where it's not consistently voting for one party or another. Then there's swing states that have a tilt, but still are in play. So, today Arizona is a swing state. For example, it's flipped back and forth on who it votes for president. Its Senate races have been relatively close, so on and so forth, right? Versus, say Wyoming is not, no one's guessing how Wyoming is going to vote in any particular election. No one is guessing, conversely, how Vermont is going to vote in any election going forward. They didn't guess in the 1930s either. There's a an old movie I was watching recently where I think it's Bob Hope makes some joke like a Democrat in Vermont, ha 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 ha, that would never happen. And I found some news stories saying Vermont, as always, goes Republican, right? So shifts do happen. And New England has clearly shifted. And it's worth noting that New England and the Pacific states shifted largely at the same time. And that's because this is an odd thing, but particularly upper Pacific West, Washington and Oregon were almost exclusively settled originally by New Englanders. Any guesses? Portland, Oregon. Any guesses where its name comes from?
Isn't there a Portland, Maine?
There is a Portland, Maine. The two
Does
founders
it
of
have
that
anything to do
town.
with it?
It's exactly the two founders of that town. One of them was from Boston and one was from Portland. And I think they flipped a coin or did something to figure out which one of them gets to name their New England hometown. I've seen some people argue that Salem is named after the Salem, Massachusetts. But the point is, it was very heavily settled by, and the political culture sort of tracked New England in many ways. California is a little weirder, mostly ends up being settled by Midwesterners later on, which is why you get the weird fluke thing that Los Angeles has a Prohibition Party member of Congress in the 1920s. Not a Republican who's a prohibitionist, not a Democrat who's a prohibitionist, an actual third-party prohibitionist who's basically being powered by Iowa prohibitionists as his voter base. So New England and the Pacific states have basically switched with the South as a geography base. The Midwest has stayed basically Republican as a sort of default threshold, and the Mountain West has shifted some. So again, that suggests that there are reasons that it's not just a real simple, the parties have totally switched party. Like, why did the Midwest stay the same, right? And to help answer that, I think is worth turning to thinking about ideology particularly, and then we can say a little bit about demographics. So I have a sort of a strange take political parties in thinking of change. And I sort of alluded to this last time. I think you can draw a very, very similar through line between the Republican Party of 1860 and the Republican Party, at least of, say, pre-Trump, like 2010. The Trump phenomenon has sort of shifted it in ways that are yet to see. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. Then I'll talk about the details of why that is, of how that is. So I think that the Republican Party's ideology, and we'll walk through the platforms for why I think that is actually pretty consistent. And the Democratic Party has moved more. It has been more significant in its shifts. Okay, so what do we think of when we think of the Republican Party today? Well, if we look at the 1856 and 1860 Republican platform, its main focus is on suppressing slavery in the territories, right? We've talked about that extensively. Do you remember the other thing that they want to suppress in the territories? They call it the other twin relic of barbarism, is polygamy. They want to use federal power to suppress polygamy because the Republican Party is at the time committed to, effectively under the hood, an alliance with evangelical Christianity, right? So they are upset at the prospect of what they see as this weird, again, anti-Christian, fundamentalist, like Mormon faction, basically distorting the sort of proper understanding of the home, which, again, and they're attached more to prohibition and morals legislation. I mean, New England, the first prohibition laws are all basically being pushed by New England Republicans, right? So they have this alignment today, which, dovetails today, where we think of, at least as of 15 years ago, the Republican Party as attached to sort of, moral traditionalism, conservative, social conservatism, whatever you want to think about that. So that's a through line that I think actually carries. Whereas, the Democrats since the 1830s had been more skeptical of sort of Sunday blue laws, which you can't run a business on Sunday, or you can't deliver the mail on Sunday, right? So the Democrats were historically more skeptical of that kind of translation. Again, the Republicans weren't saying they wanted a theocracy. That's pretty clear. But they were more comfortable with sort of social mores and preferences being enforced at the policy level, at the state level generally, at the federal level, in the few places like the territories where they could. And this connects back to the point about the geographic shift. We think of New England today, we think of it as very secular. But New England is still, a few generations out of basically being old Puritans in some ways, right? So it is evangelical Christians and some Unitarians as well that are basically spinning off of that to then become the secularism. But the laws that the laws that get struck down in the 60s on contraception, like for contraception laws we'll talk about, those are passed by basically evangelical Republicans in the late 19th century. Calvin Coolidge is basically sort of the last kind of throwback to this old model. So it's not surprising that New England shifts when it basically ceases to be primarily evangelicals. Like, it's going to shift because its ideology, the ideology has stayed the same, but who's interested in it has changed a little bit. So yeah, it's not an accident, like I said, that Griswold v. Connecticut and Eisenstadt v. Baird, these are the two Supreme Court cases striking down contraceptive laws. Those are propagated in the 60s by those states that have become very Catholic, but they're protecting the old New England Protestant places that the New England Protestants themselves have given up on because they themselves have largely secularized. So that's an interesting sort of thoroughfare that's continuous. As I talked about in the last episode, the Republican Party has generally held a fairly constant view of civil rights enforcement, which is basically colorblind, formal legal equality, but a squeamishness about the government basically doing compensatory or affirmative action type policies. You see this in the way that they write the Civil Rights Act of 1866. You see this in how quickly they want to get rid of the Freedmen's Bureau because they want to think of it as a temporary wartime measure to eliminate sort of the vestiges of slavery at the end of the war, but they don't want it to be a sort of permanent federal program. So we see that through line. The Republican Party views itself as friendly with small and big business. That's why they shift in terms of the way that they view tariffs changes all over time. But they view themselves as the pro-tariff party because they view this as the pro-business thing. So again, that's, I think, a through line today. We generally think of the Republicans as the party of sort of business or more free enterprise or something like that. Again, tweaks at the margins. If we look at the early Republican political coalition on immigration, right? The Republican Party, one of its groups is the Know-Nothings that build into it. And the Know-Nothings had been an explicitly anti-immigration party. And if you look at in the 1880s and 1890s at the Republican platforms, they're the ones that are starting to get particularly squeamish about immigration. The one that jumped out at me recently when I was looking at it is they have this real fixation on what they call the purity of the ballot. They're really fixated on that in the 1880s and 90s in voter fraud. That one sort of comes and goes, but that jumped out at me as a sort of strange continuity without commenting on the merits of more recent discussions of voting. But like this, the rhetoric popped back up. So you see that. So you see these sort of interesting through lines in terms of the ideology of the Republican Party on that front, right? The Democratic Party has tended to have a little more movement. So as we talked about in the last podcast, originally they have a very, very strong white supremacist angle, but they also build as through the 30s a sort of much more sort of progressive. They want to have sort of compensatory or affirmative action policy. They want to make sure that government is basically acting to right historical wrongs, right? So they think that they can use the power of the federal government to do that. So they switch from being a white supremacist aligned party to a sort of compensatory party in some ways, right? So that's a significant shift, right? In neither way are they basically doing the kind of colorblind constitutionalism, but they're shifting in terms of what they view on civil rights. So that's a pretty significant shift. Both parties have been basically pretty consistently anti-monopoly for a long time. That comes out of Andrew Jackson, which both parties in some ways can point to as their historical perspective. As I mentioned, the Democratic Party tends to be more uneasy about connections between Christian morals specifically and state policy making. This gets complicated, though, in the New England states with the mass influx of Catholic immigration and generations afterward. So the Democratic Party, it tilts toward being the more pro-life party basically through the 80s for this reason, right? You know, Ted Kennedy, Joe Biden, others, these figures initially get their starts as sort of pro-life leaning Republicans on that front because they view that as the core thing of what their Catholic understanding is. And again, the two states that have restrictions on contraception are both very heavily Catholic states. That sort of shifts later on. Obviously, we'll talk more about that. So the real shift, and then on federalism issues, is where there's been, I think, the biggest shift. Federalism issues, but also, as I mentioned, the civil rights issues. There's not that much difference between the Republicans and the Democrats on federalism, federal government power issues, basically until the 1930s. You have factions of each party that are more comfortable with national power and factions of each party which are more sort of states' rights, hesitant to use federal power. And both of those factions, and in the 1930s, and I know we're going to talk to Sid Milkis later in the history section. He's going to talk more about the political coalition shifting. But basically, Franklin Roosevelt remakes the difference between a Republican and a Democrat. As of like 1928, it's effectively whether you like tariffs or not. And the Republicans are more sympathetic to civil rights enforcement. But that's basically it. Other issues are pretty mixed. Franklin Roosevelt realigns the parties to effectively be one of these is the party of a stronger federal government with much more sort of economic regulation, a welfare state, et cetera. And the Republicans are the party that isn't that. And so the more sort of economically libertarian Democrats move into the Republicans, and the more sort of economically populist or progressive Republicans that want to see a stronger welfare state at the federal level, they move to be Democrats. That is, I think, the clearest significant shift. So on that one, again, the Democratic Party moves more. The Republican Party still stays basically a moderately states' rights party, whereas the Democrats had a stronger fanatical states' rights wing that then basically they just say, we're not doing federalism anymore. So that's the really, really major shift, I think, is to federalism issue, which then plays out, as we talked about in the last podcast, on civil rights. But I've teased this a couple of times. But if you think about the demographics, this helps, I think, explain where the parties have shifted in terms of their geographic bases. Before I do that, the other major shift is a result of the 1960s. And it's less, I would say, about the civil rights and more about sort of social issues becoming sort of the main fault line between the parties. And again, you see echoes of this before, with the Democrats being uneasy about Sunday blue laws and the Republicans wanting to use state government to close business. But it really becomes in the sort of 60s through the 80s that Catholic voters split internally. So Catholic voters that are more socially conservative align with the Republicans. Protestants and post-Protestants who are more socially progressive move over to the Democrats. So you're basically, between the 30s and the 60s, you're picking your party based on whether you want a federal welfare state, how big you want the federal welfare state to be, basically. After that, increasingly, you're picking it based on social issues. What do you think of Roe v. Wade, for example? What do you think of issues related to, same-sex marriage or whatever, right? Those environmentalism becomes another one, right? Environmentalism, obviously, both parties have early interest in that, but the way that environmentalism gets understood after the 70s gets sort of sucked into the same sort of social issues kind of thing. And immigration lags a little bit. And this is one where there's really interesting shifts because for a long time, you have factions of both parties that are pro and anti-immigration. The Republican Party has a sort of cultural conservative faction that is squeamish about immigration, or they're concerned about sort of we have to have limits on it lest we get exceed assimilation. But you have a big business faction that wants cheap labor. Conversely, on the Democrats, you have a sort of more cosmopolitan faction that is less interested in sort of national borders, that tends to be more sympathetic to a more liberal immigration policy. But you also have the old labor movement that views immigration as economic competition. So this is why this feels like forever ago, but you go back to 2016 and you have Bernie Sanders criticizing loose immigration policy as a Koch brothers funded like corporate conspiracy, because he comes from that old faction which tended to have the labor unions were skeptical on that, right? So that's one where there's again, clear party sorting, right? So the parties have sorted on federal welfare state issues, and then with a cleavage attached to that as well on social issues, which is why then, as we think about where has the geography changed, in many ways, it's that the different areas have different sort of concentrations of people believing those things. There aren't any New England Puritans left. So, of course, New England isn't going to be sympathetic to a Republican Party that's interested in evangelical morality, right? The area has secularized. And so a party that's more committed to sort of social conservative views is not going to be appealing there. Conversely, areas with large numbers of Catholics that are particularly Orthodox Catholics are going to drift toward the Republican Party as they view social issues as a main issue. And this is a sort of a strange thing, but a lot of and I'm not a polling guy, so I'm not going to be, if you ask me follow-up questions, I will balk. But, for example, we have the narrative of a gender gap in our voting. But, the gender gap disappears and reverses once you put a marriage overlay on it, right? So, like, for example, married white women vote Republican, even in the Trump era. Marriage is actually doing a lot more of the work. And similarly, if you were to take a married evangelical Hispanic woman, probabilistically, she actually votes Republican, right? So we have all these really, interesting interlays. The one exception on that is among Black Americans, for whom the Black church remains a very organized, politically active party. That's one of the probably one of the strange exceptions where younger secular Black voters are more likely to be Republicans than their peers, right? They're not more likely to be Republicans compared to, the voting base as a whole, but that's one of the few exceptions. So that the narrative is in some sense, how have they changed? But for me, the more interesting question is, where do we see the continuities, particularly ideologically? I guess the really, really, really high level take that one could say that I think helps explain how, even as the parties have shifted in terms of some of their geography, I would say since the 1850s, the Republican Party has been more closely identified with people that think that they are, or I guess I'll flip this the other way around. The Democratic Party has basically defined its identity as those that feel sort of left out or at the margins of society. Now, who is at the margins shifts. So if you're Catholic in the 1870s, you feel very marginalized and you want no part of that Republican Party. If you're Catholic in 1960, 1968, your Catholic identity is not doing the same work for you. And this is why you can see, immigrant groups, they land in New York. Italian Americans are very democratic. And then they sort of ceased, like the Italian thing is doing less for them. And so they identify less as a kind of an outgroup. And so you can extend this out. You can extend this out in many ways. So if you view yourself as a religious minority, you view yourself as an ethnic minority, you view yourself as sort of outside. Whereas then conversely, the Republicans have historically been the party of people that sort of have weaker senses of that sense of sort of isolation or marginalization or something along those lines. Or so again, this is all, I guess I just reiterate, this is all very high level probabilistic, right? Like obviously any individual is going to have different reasons, right? Maybe you have a particular life experience that means that you grew up among another community, or, maybe you served in the military with people who had a perspective of X or whatever, right? So this is all, whenever you're doing, voting behavior kind of stuff, it's all high level statistics. I want to just emphasize this is not saying like you are X demographic and therefore you must be Y party. That's completely wrong, but this is probabilistic.
Because we see that a lot, especially in presidential years where they show the graphs, on TV, and these are the demographics that they're looking at. And if you're teaching or you're taking AP government, that's one of the things they talk about is it's a generalization.
Yeah.
That does not mean that it applies to every single person, because I know that there is somebody listening who's like, well, I'm X, Y, and Z, and I'm not this. Yes, that's the beautiful thing about it. We are speaking in generalizations here.
Right. It's been, and there are things that are going to be cross-cutting, right? So like you might be some part of your identity or ideology suggests one way and it may cut another way. And, and you're going to have, in some sense, you have to decide, does that mean that I align more with a party? Do I formally organize with that party and try to pull them to my side on those other issues? Do I just remain a non-aligned swing voter or something like that, right? So there's all these complications about sort of strategy as well on that front. But so the basic takeaway is I do think there's a through line of the two parties have had a different perspective of, do you see yourself as basically sort of marginalized in some capacity? That has generally been a predictor. Geography has shifted, but largely as the demographics have shifted. When New England is all Puritans, it's very Republican. When New England is more of a mix of Catholics and sort of secular people whose grandparents might have been evangelicals, they're going to have a very different voting behavior. Going back to the last podcast, if you're a super poor Southerner, the New Deal looks pretty good with its sort of economic, a more robust protective welfare state that's immunizing you from, a bad yield or something like that. If you're basically like a small businessman in, middle-sized Southern city in 1970, actually, low taxes might look better for you. And so, this is where the ideology and the geography have really interesting overlays. So I know that's really, really weird and technical in many ways, that I've gone through really strange, tedious stuff, but I just really don't like the narrative of the parties flipped on X. And so therefore, and that's not accurate for the reasons that you were just talking about. Mm-hmm. Like, people have different interest ideologies, et cetera, that don't just collapse down to, here's my geography or here's my demographic group per se. Some of these things have interactions with each other, but.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's just more nuance. That's the entire kind of point of this podcast, is we can't just say, nope, things switched because this happened. There is a lot of nuance within it, and it doesn't always apply to everyone. So, Dr. Beienberg, again, thank you for taking this very large topic and giving us things to think about, giving us more information so that we can just be better informed citizens. We appreciate it.
I would just say is one thing that, pull up party platforms and read them. Not the last few, because they've gotten so insanely long, but up to 1936, you could read the party platforms are a couple pages each. So you can see these sorts of continuities in really interesting ways, or discontinuities.
Mm-hmm. Would federal political parties be different than the state political parties? Would you say, you want to make sure you're reading both?
The state political parties are often, party platforms are just descriptively hard to get. So that may make it a little more complicated. I'm trying to remember if we have a party thing on the civic literacy curriculum. I think we might have some of those on there, but if not, it's on my to-do list. But there is some semblance. You're right to note this, and you made my day as a federalism person, right? That there's a difference between the state and federal parties. And this is something that I know Sid Milkus will definitely talk about in the podcast on that, how the state parties do have a lot more variety through the New Deal. That one of the things that is really a shift of the FDR system is that it nationalizes that. Whereas before, as I said, the parties don't disagree that much. They basically both want minimal federal government so they can do whatever they want at the state level, which is then going to do all kinds of different things. Whether you're, a Republican in Wisconsin is very different than a Republican in New England is very different than a Republican in, Idaho in 1920. But the federal platforms, I think, for our purposes, probably will get most of what I'm suggesting here. But yes, looking at state documents is never a bad idea.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.